Western Interstate Energy Board. Welcome and thank you for attending the third and final webinar from our series of webinars on cybersecurity of electric utility industrial control systems. This week's webinar builds on what we've learned over the past 2 weeks and will focus on the policy that states and provinces may set aimed at encouraging good cyber practices. This webinar series is meant to help policymakers understand the threat of cyber attacks on the utility systems, what is being done to mitigate risks, and ultimately how and what types of public policy should be created. Previously, we got an introduction into utility industrial control systems and discussed some of the cyber risks and threats to electric utility industrial control systems. Last week, we covered power grid resilience and mitigating the impacts of cyber events. Today, we will focus on public policy through a discussion aimed at helping states and provincial policymakers in the West build policies that encourage sound cybersecurity practices. Today, again, we have Roger Hill from Veracity Industrial Networks and Earl Shockley from InPOWERd, LLC. Roger Hill is the founder and chief technology officer at Veracity, a cybersecurity tech startup company focused on delivering resilient and secure industrial network platforms. He brings 20-plus years of industrial control experience in many different industrial segments. Prior to Veracity, Roger worked for Siemens as a global head of technology management in their plant security services business and was responsible for the development of key strategic technologies as part of a comprehensive security program for industrial customers. He is recognized as a global leader and subject matter expert in cybersecurity for industrial control systems. Earl Shockley is president, founder, and chief manager of InPOWERd, LLC, a consulting services firm specializing in executive strategy, grid operations, cybersecurity, and regulatory compliance. Earl is a former regulator at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, and was instrumental in NERC's shift to risk-based compliance and enforcement. He's was a key contributor to analytical investigative efforts into the September 8th, 2011 blackout, the February 2011 Southwest cold snap, as well as many other events. Earl is a strategic advisor for various regulatory agencies, a sought-after public speaker, expert witness on complex issues, regulatory compliance, risk management, internal risk controls, and event and casual analysis. Additionally, Maury Galbraith, the executive director here at the Western Interstate Energy Board, will help facilitate the discussion today. Finally, just some logistics for the webinar. Currently, we have all participants muted, but we are looking to make this session much more interactive. Roger and Earl have about 5 to 10 slides that they will quickly cover to recap previous discussions and describe some policy challenges. After they complete their short presentation, we will facilitate a discussion on the policy implications of what was presented. You can send questions via the chat box, but we are also looking to get states and provinces to share experiences with policy sets within their states or elsewhere. I will now turn the webinar over to Roger.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. So let me go ahead and move forward here. So in our first webinar, we spent a significant amount of time really talking about what are industrial control systems. What are the different types of these systems and the typical devices that compose these systems, such as SCADAs and RTUs and PLCs. We also discussed some of the adversaries and the motivations of these different adversaries. We spent a few minutes discussing some of the common threat vectors, such as SneakerNet and some of the specific challenges in industrial with bring your own devices. Now we're going to do a quick recap of the anatomy of a cyber attack. So this is based upon a physical lab test environment. In this example, the adversary wants to change the behavior of the control system. So to do this, the program in the PLC needs to be modified in order to change that physical behavior of the process. In this example, there's a firewall that separates the business network from the process network. The firewall is essentially configured to allow the business network to access web servers on the internet. Now, the web clients on the business network are really just initiating that connection. So the adversary, he doesn't actually know the IP address of the intended victim that sits on that business network. The adversary simply has the email address. So in order for the adversary to really utilize a spear phishing attack on the victim, first let's really recap what a spear phishing attack is. It all starts with knowing something about the victim, some personal information, because ultimately, for a spear phishing attack to be successful, it has to be designed to really evoke an emotional reaction of the victim, to get that victim to actually click on a link or open an attachment without really thinking about it first. In this example, the victim is sent an email, and that email traverses from that adversary through the internet to the office user. The office user receives this email, and this email was crafted in such a way that that causes that victim to really click on that attachment, which in this case is a PDF attachment, without first really thinking about whether they should open that attachment. That's really the whole definition of a spear phishing attack. So when that user clicks on that attachment, that actually launches that exploit. Now that exploit then reaches back to that adversary, and it's essentially saying, give me that bad stuff. And that adversary is then initiating a reverse TCP connection back to that victim, and this results in the victim being pwned or really owned. It's a remote code execution attack. So now, at this stage, the adversary is really moving into the reconnaissance stage from that office user PC. Really just identifying the hosts and services and really fingerprinting the operating systems used within that subnet. So next, the adversary is actually launching the next stage of the attack from the office user. So the adversary has discovered the engineering manager and attacks the engineering manager from this office user PC. The adversary uses an RPC-based vulnerability that they discovered to exploit the engineering manager. And of course, the result is the engineering manager is now pwned. The engineering manager, the adversary discovers, has remote access to the engineering workstation on the process control network. So this is actually the next stage of the attack for the adversary. So the adversary leverages another RPC, this time an SMB vulnerability, to attack the engineering workstation. Now, once the engineering workstation is pwned, the adversary can now modify the user program to really change the PLC, the program that's actually in the PLC. To do this, the adversary actually configures this in the offline program within that engineering workstation. This new program is then pushed to the PLC from the engineering workstation, which now compromises the PLC, and this ultimately changes the behavior of the physical process. So in the second webinar, Earl and I discussed resilience and reliability of the grid. We also discussed specific technology innovations within the U.S. Department of Energy in their SEDS program. One of these projects is the Chessmaster project, which is really focused on the autonomous attack surface reduction of energy delivery systems. So in the Chessmaster project, we're really focused on efforts to define security policy and have this policy enforced at the Ethernet switch. So in other words, this approach provides all of the benefits of a centralized orchestration approach, which gives 100% visibility of all devices and communication, but it creates really a foundation for situation awareness. So Chessmaster also defines threat states into 5 categories, from normal to adversary reconnaissance, serious, very serious, and direct targeted attack. We then map each of these threat states to defense readiness conditions that represent a distinct pre-designed and pre-tested security policy. So let's look at DEFCON 5. So this represents our baseline, in which it's really normal operating conditions with no known threats. This is our blue sky territory. So for example, would this DEFCON 5 threat state would represent the least restrictive and most permissive defense posture, really focused on the safe and normal operating conditions of the system. While DEFCON 4 really represents the reconnaissance activity of an adversary. So when we map this to the stages of the cyber kill chain, for example, this represents the first stage of the campaign. So specific response at this threat state could be to define deception-based response to host and server scan activity by an adversary. So this stage would also represent more stringent alerting responses by operational personnel. Now, let's just jump ahead to the DEFCON 1. This is really the direct targeted attack, and it actually represents how we are going to respond to that type of an attack. At this threat state, really only mission-critical devices would be permitted to communicate via mission-critical communication. So a further micro-segmentation, if you will, into autonomous cells also prevents the propagation or the lateral movement by the adversary on the network. So the ultimate goal is to have a pre-designed response to each threat state, which allows the defenders to really respond in an automated way. Earl, you want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. For this slide, I'd like to just cover for you a couple of terms that you often hear: compliance and security. I often hear these terms used interchangeably. Like last week, we talked about resilience and reliability. In the same manner, compliance and security is often used interchangeably. And they're very different. They're distinctly different, and they play different but very important roles. As a former motorcycle safety instructor, I used to have these conversations with students about, okay, meeting the law, meeting the rule as they were preparing and taking safety courses to ride a motorcycle. I used this slide for a perfect example, and I find it very relevant for our discussion, compliance and security. First off, compliance does not equal security, and you might find that strange coming from an ex-regulator. But consider this: it is merely a snapshot of how your security program meets a specific set of security requirements at a given moment in time. And as an auditor, when I would go in and I would audit, I would look for these specific snapshots. I would look for these times and dates to ensure that the programs were meeting these specific set of reliability standards. Okay? So compliance really corresponds to a set of specific requirements that change slowly. It's not about a daily dynamic change within the security landscape. Compliance is rules. It takes these, sometimes years to get these rules developed, and they're based on the current state happenings and the current stage technology, if you will. Now, don't get me wrong, compliance is necessary. It establishes a minimum baseline of competency and protection, okay? Compliance is a fabric, if you will, that runs through your overall security program. However, in of itself, it typically does not address the entire risk or all the vulnerabilities that threaten your landscape. Security, on the other hand, is your defense in depth approach to protection. So if you look at the pictures, you'll see that this lady, and I actually took this picture, I was in traffic one day, actually by state law in the state that I took that picture, she was perfectly compliant. All she had to have on for a two-wheeled motor vehicle was a helmet and eye protection, and she has that. But if you look at the difference between her picture and the security picture, you'll kind of get the picture of what I'm talking about. Is she really secure? She's meeting compliance, but no, she's not really secure, okay? There's a lot of things that could happen to her in the course of an accident versus a person that is fully protected in the mode of security, we'll say, okay? Another thing that's important to know is compliance should never be your blueprint. Okay? An effective cybersecurity program includes risk and vulnerability assessments, monitoring, detection, responses, mitigation, and it should be based on the organization's needs and the complexity and the infrastructure that they have present. Okay? I always recommend to my clients that they consider compliance as a byproduct of a solid security program, not the source of it. Okay? Because compliance rarely leads to good security, but good security, as you can see from this picture, will always lead to compliance. Okay? So as this slide points out, being compliant does not necessarily mean you're being secure, at least not as secure as you should be. Next slide.
So now let's switch gears just for a couple minutes and really discuss some of the specific challenges in the commercialization of technology innovation. So if we were to visualize technology as a funnel, with the end user being the narrow end of the funnel, this would represent the actual commercialization of technology and adoption of technology. So at the top of our funnel, academia, national labs, and research organizations, they truly excel at original research, which results in innovative technologies that ultimately solve problems. These researchers truly do excel at the actual research, the examination of empirical evidence and problem solving with truly outside the box thinking skills. Their expertise is not in the commercialization of these technologies though. So this results often with technology that simply collects dust and it's not actually implemented. Now, as we move into the next stage of this funnel, we have large companies that are really well funded. More often than not, these large companies are really focused on the next release of a product in their product lifecycle, which really is taking an iterative-based approach of improving the previous release. So large companies typically are not agile enough. They're very siloed, so that they really struggle at driving disruptive innovation, at least without a sound acquisition and integration strategy. So finally, at the most narrow end of this funnel, we have the tech startup world. So here, these are typically small teams of entrepreneurs who they're pretty much risk takers. They excel at driving products to market quickly, and they're typically not well funded, and they really cannot afford the time that's really required for a lot of that original research. So what is really needed is a bridge to really be able to bridge all of these different entities within the funnel. The question is, how can we advance original research to drive disruptive technologies with really focusing on the commercialization and the adoption of these technologies?
So for this slide, what we want to get across is we want to outline how state and national programs are trying to bridge this gap that Roger talked about, okay? From original research to technology innovation to rapid commercialization. What's taking place out there right now to help this, to move this along? I do know as a former regulator, when we were always faced with the challenge of inspiring support, identifying advocates for purpose and missions of our initiatives. And this is the same thing, state-driven incentives, federal level initiatives. These are all trying to inspire and bring forth advocates to help push rapid technology into commercialization. So it's important for us to understand that technology-based innovation, it is a driver of our U.S. and global economy. It fuels diverse sectors, including manufacturing, aerospace, defense, energy, medicine, emerging technologies that we've been talking about over the last couple of webinars, including software-defined networks. The goal is to lead to evolutionary improvements in existing products and processes and lead to entirely new ways of addressing issues and helping businesses, right? So several of the things that I see here on the slide that I'd like to cover for you. First off is the federal level initiatives. We've talked about the Doe Chessmaster. Here's another example, Sunshot. It's an incubator program, all right? It's earliest stage assistance to help startup companies, address particularly the money barrier that Roger was just talking about, because a lot of these startups aren't well funded, and they have, individuals that are taking a lot of risk upon themselves and a lot of time, effort, and sweat and ideas. So these are really important initiatives for them to get involved with. The states have a lot of different creative structures that reward innovators and entrepreneurs. And their goal is to attract business to their state, right? They want to be able to build these businesses within their boundaries. And a couple of things that they do, for example, the national labs, which are just incubators, and Roger had that in his slide. They use state-sponsored initiatives and programs, and they work and cross-pollinate, and they nurture an environment for technological commercialization within the states, okay? Colorado is a very good example. They've joined with 170 industry, academia, government partners, and through the Digital Manufacturing Design Innovation Institute, they are really driving innovative research. They're working with the Department of Defense. One of the things they're doing is helping prioritize securing manufacturing cyber processes. They have found that there's a lot of vulnerabilities there, and they want to have a really good foundation to address these, and they want that awareness at all the different levels. Another thing that we're seeing, and this is something that excites me, I'm an adjunct professor at my alumni, universities and colleges have created technical commercialization degrees. Okay, this is a really entrepreneurial approach, like it says here, to bring technological innovation to market, right? Particularly the commercial market. And I gave a couple examples there. USC does it, ASU does it. Here in Tennessee, they have it as well. This is really good, and these degrees are shifting to online as well. So you have very busy technical people that can achieve these degrees in this knowledge domain, online as well as sitting in the class. And another thing that's on the list here that ties directly to the universities and colleges as well as the national labs is technology transfer programs. These programs of exchanging information on technologies from coding to different approaches and working in these boiling pots, if you will, with entrepreneurs, with groups, with companies, with labs to come up with the solution of problems is just a really great program. And we see these four things taking place. It's really important to know that the federal government plays a significant role. I mean, they have an interest in this, right? I mean, they run a business just like everybody else, although it's government business. So they really are interested in applied research, state development. They're interested in how the private sector plays a dominant role in pushing these things over the line. Okay, next slide. So let's just talk a little bit about how do we drive the adoption of innovation, right? The carrot. I got the carrot hanging there. And if you look at my slide, what I tried to communicate here is what I believe are really important matters, okay? It's important to understand that there are forces that influence the adoption, and these forces spread technical innovation, okay? One of these key forces, are incentives, okay? Some of the examples I have here I'd like to give for you is three categories, okay? Electric vehicles, microgrids, and renewables. Okay, so if we look at the electric vehicle industry, I have a friend that just a couple of years ago was all excited. He purchased a new electric vehicle. He was telling me about all these federal tax credits he was getting, and the tax credits could be up to $7,500 for purchase or lease of a new electric vehicle. He was getting initiatives and tax credits for putting a charging station in his home. Businesses, from what I understand, can recoup up to $30,000 in charger installation costs. And each of the manufacturers got incentives from federal and state levels, and they were passing these incentives on to customers. These manufacturers, like for example Tesla, they're about to achieve 200,000 electric vehicles. They're just slightly ahead of GM in this, subsidized under these programs. After they sell 200,000, these incentives kind of peel off. But the key is my friend got this electric car, and he got all these tax breaks, and he just saved a ton of money, and he feels like he's giving back to the environment as well. So if we think about microgrids, which we talked a little bit about last week, right, and the importance of microgrids, and the federal governments and states are putting together environmental incentives, energy incentives, tax credits. The federal government is giving grant money to help drive the innovation and the development of these. And in turn, there is this return on investment, right? There is the benefit coming from this, right? As they develop the grids, if you look at my slide, there's increased energy security. You can better integrate the renewables. You have grid resiliency, which we talked about last week, right? You can shave peak loads. There's just a lot of things that you can do with a microgrid and the adoption of those. There's been a lot of utility rebates and incentive programs for microgrids, particularly ones that benefit resiliency and grid, like battery storage, for example, or a locational value where if they built that microgrid, it would actually reduce capital spending for them. If they were going to build a new distribution system or whatever, they don't have to spend the money. The entrepreneurs and the microgrid investors come in and build and offset that capital funding, if you will. And if it incorporates green energy, which is the third piece, renewables, solar energy, wind, they even get further incentives. They get federal grants. They get benefits from the utilities themselves, and they're connecting contracts and so on and so forth. So each one of these examples that I'm giving here, renewables, microgrids, electric cars, these have all been driven to the level that they are through one powering factor of innovation and the adoption of innovation, and that's incentives. And as policymakers, thinking of creative ways, to drive and adopt innovation with incentives is just a very good model. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so thank you to Roger and Earl for sort of recapping the first and second webinars. We want to sort of get into a discussion with the people on the line about the cyber threat, the potential response to that threat, and what states and provinces can do to help in this space. So I think the Colorado example, the secure Colorado example, Earl and Roger, is an interesting example. Is that a situation where the state of Colorado is actually incenting the development of cyber solutions, or maybe start by providing a little bit more information about that. And while Roger and Earl are answering that question, if people are interested in joining the conversation, you can hit *7 to unmute your lines. But Roger, Earl, can you maybe give us a little bit more information about that Secure Colorado program and whether or not it is actively incenting cybersecurity solutions?
So I can jump in here real quick. So a couple years ago, I was involved with an initiative that ultimately was still part of the Secure Colorado, which was aligned with the DMDII that Earl mentioned. So this was being sponsored by funding from the Department of Defense, and the initiative that we were trying to drive was a cybersecurity for advanced manufacturing. So I was brought in as really the expert for cybersecurity in manufacturing to help drive that. Now, ultimately, we weren't successful in landing that particular program, but I think what's important, really the important takeaway, is the proactive approach that I recognize from the state of Colorado and their Secure Colorado initiative. And there's been several initiatives after that as well. So I think that just represents one example of really a state taking very proactive measures and thinking outside the box. Now, that particular program was originally with match funding from the government, and then they had different tiers. So you had the larger corporations that could come in at one tier level with dollar matching, and then at the bottom of those tiers were the tech startups and small business. You had academia and national labs also involved. So it was really truly that funnel-based approach to take on original research, but really focus on commercialization. That's one example, Eric.
Great, thank you, Roger. Are there others on the call that would like to either ask a question or make a comment about the role of states in ensuring cybersecurity?
Yeah, hey, Maury, this is Jordan White from Utah. First of all, thank you for putting on these webinars. These have been very informative, and thank you to Earl and Roger. The one thought I was having, I guess, and maybe I'll just kind of preface this by giving a little bit of Utah's general kind of regulatory philosophy, which is, obviously, I think everyone, in the energy space right now, cybersecurity is kind of, top of our mind. There's a lot of, things going on that give us a lot of concern. But the one thing I was kind of thinking is, from our perspective in Utah, typically, we see ourselves pretty firmly in the policy implementer rather than maker space. And so what I guess I was kind of pondering is, typically in these other areas, is this something that comes from legislation? Because, for example, like in Utah, we at times will approve, R&D, kind of non-used and useful type projects if we've been giving directive from legislative or, elected officials. So I'm just kind of curious to know, is that typically where that derives from in the areas you've seen this happen, where there's actually been approval to kind of, again, get the funding from that area?
Roger, you got some thoughts on that one?
Go ahead, Earl. If
well,
not, I can take it.
Yeah, go ahead and take it.
Yeah, so I think that the division is really the implementation side, the policy side. So it's really, I suppose the contrast is whether you're looking to take some proactive measures. So, for example, one of the states was taking an approach of really building out a center of competence for cyber for the state. And this is really designed to really augment, provide technical expertise and threat intelligence and other capabilities to security operations personnel within the state's critical infrastructure. So again, this is more on the proactive side. Now, how do they go about doing that? The only way to do that is with an ecosystem of partnerships with state universities and private companies, as well as the critical the asset owners themselves, versus just on the policy side. So I tend to look at this of it's the carrot or the stick approach. On the stick side, this is where I think it's not quite as clear for me, from my vantage point, of what a state can do to augment the stick approach when it's part of the national electric grid. Maybe Earl can speak more specific to that.
Sure, and my thoughts around this is I believe the state has a very important role, particularly with the carrot side, like Roger says. As a former regulator, I can tell you that a lot of times federal regulation and rules that are developed, they actually impede the ability of states, large companies, and technical startup groups to do what they need to do. For example, one of the pushbacks at NERC has been for the SIP standards is that the standards and the rules coming from the federal level and pushing down have been very prescriptive. Okay, they define exactly what you're supposed to do. It's very cookie cutter, right? and that's very difficult for large, medium, and small companies that are not, cookie cutter fit. All of their topology is different. Their organizations are different. Their cultures are different. How they approach things are very different. Rather than having a non-prescriptive approach which allows, the innovation, if you will, and the ability to blend these performance goals, if you will, the level of performance you're expecting them to have within their own processes and procedures and their own innovations. And what that does is it drives people towards the administrative side. They're so worried about checking the box with compliance that they're not focusing on how we can do things better, how we can be more secure. So what I've seen with the state sides, and the example with Colorado and Massachusetts and New York has another one, where they get involved and they incentivize, right? They support the academia level, they support the national labs, and they get involved in that manner, and they inspire problem solving, right? They inspire this problem solving around the problems of security, around protecting against the environment. Like I mentioned, the standards that are out there, and if you're living up to them, those were developed 3, 4, 5 years ago, current state, and they might not be so applicable to what is occurring today. So I see the state having a very important role, like in Utah, to be able to be a driver of innovation and help, this funneling that Roger's talking about, helping that academia and those national labs, all those great ideas to get into the larger companies' efforts and the technical startups, and bringing the best of the best to the table to resolve the problems, rather than just relying on, okay, we've got this set of rules. If we live up to those rules, we'll be fine, which we've found we won't. So that'd be my thoughts.
Other questions from the audience for Earl or Roger?
This is Tony Usabelli from the state of Washington.
Hey, Tony.
Howdy. I just wanted to highlight one thing, and perhaps I don't know whether I've got any colleagues from the Utilities and Transportation Commission or from some of the Washington utilities here, but just wanted to note that one of the things that we've been doing in Washington is working very closely among utilities, our utility commission, and our military department and National Guard on cyber security issues. Relatively recently, the National Guard, which has a number of folks that work in high tech and have strong computer skills, worked with our public utility north of Seattle, Snohomish Public Utility District, on evaluating the cybersecurity of their system. And that's gotten a fair amount of press because it's been an opportunity to tie some of the state resources to the specific needs of the utilities. And Washington has had a series of now 4 different summits focused on critical infrastructure cyber security work. In fact, I think one of those summits occurred just in the last week or so, number 4 in that space. So there's been a working group here in Washington made up of utilities, government, and some private sector folks focusing specifically on cybersecurity for critical infrastructure, in particular related to electric utilities. I just wanted to mention that. Be glad to share any of those links and any of those connections for folks.
That's a great example.
Hey, this is Jordan White again. A question I was wondering is, again, we're not, just so you know, so we're the economic regulator. I'm a public service commissioner, so we don't really see ourselves as necessarily experts in the area, and we kind of rely on the utilities to bring forward plans or costs or projects, et cetera, and then we ultimately review those for prudence. But we do get pretty regular updates on what they're doing. We don't like to get too much confidential proprietary information, mostly just because we essentially don't want to do any harm. But one question I was wondering, is there a standard set of potential questions we should be asking utilities in terms of what they're doing in this space to make sure that they're secure and they're implementing everything they can to make sure that the grid's secure?
So I'll go ahead and jump in there. I would tend to look at a different tack because I do think that they're working with auditors and regulators, and there's quite a bit of resources in the consulting space in terms of helping them prepare for an audit and understand if they're compliant. I think from a state perspective, when you begin that dialogue with your utilities, it's understanding their pain points. Asking them where state resources could help. Whether it's on the people, process, technologies, just identifying those pain points, almost like a task force initiative to really start to identify what their early outset program could begin to look like and take shape. Earl, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you covered it. I think that, InPOWERd is a good example, okay? And I often talked to a state public commissioner not long ago, and they were talking about InPOWERd, and would it be a good idea for them to, put forth some of the ideas that InPOWERd has. And one of the things that InPOWERd does is that it publicly recognizes those who achieve operational excellence and innovation. So they're always on the lookout across the fleet of plants, and the public commissioner was really interested in maybe applying this to how they look at the utilities across our state. And I thought it was just a really good idea to implement for them, because what InPOWERd does is they recognize those who achieve operational excellence and innovation for the nuclear industry, and they grade them. They're on a scale. And even in the InPOWERd office, they have, these plaques, and they have everybody's name. They got the gold star, right? This actually drives a competitive response, within our industry, particularly in the nuclear industry. And it's really important for each of those plants to be considered, a 5-star plant, because, insurance is, involved in a lot of that, and they need to make sure that they're the best of the best, right? So I thought it was just a really good idea from this commissioner I was talking to, and I helped provide him with some information on how InPOWERd does that. But his approach was he wanted to, put that carrot out there. He wanted, a driving factor of recognition, right? We talked about a driving factor of innovation. His idea was, okay, if I recognize those who achieve operational excellence and those that bring innovation to the table, I can spur a competitive spirit across my state, and I can, bring new ideas to the table, and everybody is willing to, kind of come together and share. So that would be my thoughts.
Hey, let me ask you about this. Sorry, I don't mean to dominate. If other people have questions, I don't want to. I want to give everyone an opportunity. But the one slide that did intrigue me was the two motorcycle folks, the woman on the moped and then the other. From a kind of a regulator cost, because obviously a lot of these initiatives, et cetera, have costs associated with them. Typically, you said something about compliance doesn't mean security. So is there a good metric beyond compliance? Because, for example, when it comes to cybersecurity, typically, it seems to me at least, and I'm not a cybersecurity expert obviously, but it seems to me like the standards that come from NERC, WEC, et cetera, are kind of what typically drives investment or risk threat initiatives. How do we evaluate what is prudent or what is correct beyond that? In other words, is there something? For example, if the second slide is good, meaning the all leather clad, whatever, full helmet, is there something beyond that is, goes into the gold plated realm? Or I guess I'm just trying to figure out as a regulator what's the honest broker in terms of how much is enough and what is the right cost to deploy with the right investment.
Right. That's a really good question, and I'm glad you brought that up because there is a cost factor in there. And that's one of the reasons that, at NERC, when we were developing standards and we were putting forth ideas on how to inspire the industry to address risks, that was definitely considered. For example, we didn't want to impose a standard on somebody that would, be so costly that it would just obstruct the vision of resolving the issue, right? I always tell my clients this. You either have risk management, you're either working risk management, or you're going to be dealing in crisis management, okay? And I promise you, as a guy that did a lot of the analytical investigations at NERC for the blackouts, particularly 2011 Southwest blackout, the cost of crisis management is much more than risk management. So if you look at, managing risk when you are, putting forth, a rule or a regulation, look for a set of performance that you want to achieve, right? If you, for example, we'll use this example of the motorcycle. She's perfectly legal in that state. She's got eye protection and helmet protection. But, the rest of her body, if she was to have a wreck, she would be in serious case. But can she afford to have, the full leather and approach with the full face helmet and everything? For that example, for motorcycles, the cost of it is inconsequential versus, the crisis cost that would occur from it. So I always like to, look at things from a risk perspective. And everybody's different. And that's one of the problems with regulatory rule, and one of the things the challenges we had at NERC was we were trying to put forth a rule that would be an administrative control to reduce risk to both power system, and it's very difficult to do that when you have large, medium, and small companies that have just different cost buckets and different approaches to things, and ideas don't necessarily work across the spectrum, right? So if you put forth a rule, make sure that it's going to have a performance that you're expecting. You expect everybody to have a level of performance based on their proportion to risk, right? So if they're a highly risky organization, you're going to expect a high level of performance from them, right, versus a medium to low risk. So, and that's the direction I was taking NERC when I was there, and I know that NERC is still taking that direction in that a lot of times just putting forth a rule that sounds good on paper to eliminate a risk is not effective across the realm of folks that are going to be, the rule's going to be applicable to. And another thing is with a compliance rule, understand that even if you're totally compliant to that rule, there's still residual risk that you've got to consider as an organization as well. So cost is really important, and that's why it's important to allow organization non-prescriptive rules to where they can be flexible and innovative and creative with their budgets to achieve a level of performance you desire as a regulator versus, okay, you got to do this in a box, step, and you got to implement these tools and these rules, which, a larger company, they could absorb that cost very easily versus a smaller company, they're like, wow, that's very difficult.
So Earl, this is Maury Galbraith. Earl or Roger, can you give us a specific example of an activity or a tool that a utility would use to sort of go beyond just minimum compliance? What are the, I assume that there are some electric utilities out there that are just that are doing more than minimal compliance. Can you give us some examples of what that more might be?
So I'm going to stay with the same theme that Earl just had. I think ultimately it is about risk management. So an organization ultimately is going to have to discover or decide what is their appetite for risk or what is an acceptable level of risk. So by using a risk management framework, they can actually define that for their organization. And stepping outside of that boundary for just a moment, for example, within the regulated energy sector, generally speaking, when it comes to industrial control systems, what is really needed is to identify roles and responsibilities so that there's assigned budgets to actually drive this problem. There also has to be accountability. Someone has to be held accountable, and there has to be reporting of incidents. All of these are factors that help drive it, but ultimately it's a risk management approach to make the business case for security.
So, but again, this is Maury again. Let's assume that the business case has been made. Let's decide that people decide it's prudent to go beyond just minimum compliance with the SIP standards. What are some activities or some tools that or actions that utilities could take to go beyond minimum compliance?
So a great place to start is in the same way within your IT organizations that you'll have your desktop exercises around disaster recovery planning or response. Now, typically you're looking at exercises around, for example, if this hurricane hit, one response might be having an elevated data center, your backup generators, things like that. Taking those same principles and the same idea of the desktop exercise and apply it to cybersecurity for that control system, right? So go through those disaster response planning to define what are those different threat states. We've been talking a lot about threat states. Identify those threat states and what your response is. So desktop exercises are a great place to start. There's a lot of resources from DHS, ICS CERT, NIST. There's a lot of open source work out there available around desktop exercises. That's a great starting point because it brings the parties together, IT and security and your operations personnel.
Yeah, and Maury, this is Earl. I would chime in and say, as an organization, when I work with folks, the first question I say, what do you want to achieve? What is your level of risk? So to answer your question directly, what kind of tools are you seeing that where people step up? For example, one of the biggest ones I see is automation of manual processes. Okay, there's a lot of manual processes in place that require human interaction, and one of our huge risks, as we know, is human drift. We expect a human to operate at a certain standard, and typically they don't meet that, and it just kind of fluctuates up and down, right? So automating manual processes to ensure that you're achieving a level of compliance as well as a level of security has been something really important that I have seen folks put in place. Workflow processes to ensure that patch management is done, that it's done as quickly as possible. Folks that have really stepped up in what I call a mature organization, they have very solid change management processes in place so that when they have their enterprise risk management function look at and identify risks and threats, they then assign mitigation or risk response to those, and then they have follow-up. It's real important that all of these things take place and is ingrained in the business process. So a lot of it is awareness. It's strengthening the culture around it and having automation. I'll just bring Veracity up as an example. The Veracity tool that they have, addresses cybersecurity from the network level, rather than a more complicated, well, I have to have a firewall here, I have to have a bolt-on device here, I have to do this, I have to do that, which when you put a lot of complexity into your systems, complexity leads to avenues of vulnerability. So as you simplify all your manual processes, as you simplify your legacy systems and you use automation and you use high levels of awareness and high levels of risk-mindedness, if you will, that's what I see folks do. I mean, there's a lot of technical solutions out there. Tripwire is one that folks use to help them achieve a level of security above compliance. There's a lot of different examples of tools that folks use.
Those are great answers. I think some of those answers probably are things that public utility commissioners and state policymakers could ask of their electric utilities if they're automating their manual processes, if they've got change management in place and those sorts of things when it comes to cybersecurity. I think that helps. So we're coming up on 5 minutes left on the webinar. I want to allow other people to follow up with any additional questions that they have. Any other questions from folks on the call? Well, hearing none, I want to thank Roger Hill and Earl Shockley for what's been really 3 great weeks of webinars, and I want to thank the state folks that joined us on the call today for engaging in the conversation. And I want to remind people on the call that the recordings of the webinars are available on the WEEB webpage. Today's discussion will be posted most likely on Monday. And with that, I want to thank everybody and wish you all a good day and a happy holiday.